Essentially, this was a battle between Labour and capitalism, with Larkin, the statue is here behind me, heading up the workers, and William Martin Murphy, the employers. Now, in September of that year, the employers signed an agreement not to give work to anybody who was a member of the ITGWU and to sack people who wouldn't leave the union. Not everyone, however, agreed with these tactics. Guinness did not lock out their employees, and there was one independent employer who took a brave stand. Niall Martin reports on the businessman who stuck his head above the parapet.
This is Edward Lee, the employer who refused to join the Dublin lockout and who tried to bring both sides to their senses. Lee and Company had 4 large drapery shops across Dublin. Here in Bray, behind Dunn Stores, you can still faintly see signs of Lee's first store.
Edward Lee & Company was a large department store that had branches throughout Dublin and here in Wicklow in Bray. His first store was here. He also, a very important part of his life, obviously, because he has his 4 sons here, born above the store itself. He was a cash store. He believed in everybody pays their cash, unlike these days probably with the credit cards and things, they weren't available. So people had the money, they bought the stuff, and he was reasonably priced. That was a very important aspect to the business.
Edward's brother Michael has been piecing together the story of the employer who got stuck into the mother of all industrial disputes.
Going through the newspapers and seeing how the lockout progressed day by day, and you can follow it through linear-wise on either the Irish Times or the Independent or whatever newspapers, Freeman's Journal, you know, even local papers, you could see how it was going. And there's a certain immediacy about newspapers that you don't really get from history books of today. There's an example here of meeting in Beresford Place, James Larkin's call to arms. Large crowds gathered in the vicinity of Liberty Hall last night. I mean, you know, when you read last night, and that's 100 years ago, it really does, you can almost feel that this is happening now, you know.
Edward Lee was appalled at workers' living conditions in the Dublin slums. At a public meeting during the lockout, he declared,
"Men of capital ought to be ashamed to have it go out to the ends of the earth, that so many families are living each in one room."
Edward's social conscience began to emerge in 1900, when, standing as a unionist candidate, he headed the poll in the local elections in Bray. He immediately set about building housing for the poor. Over 110 years later, this estate still stands just off Bray's Main Street. But Edward's name is missing. Instead, one James Connolly got the recognition.
He was quite ahead of his time, really. He believed in one of his favourite sayings was a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and that was his motto. If you did the work, you got the pay. If you were someone who came in maybe as a boy riding a bike and, you know, were making deliveries, you could become a manager in his shop if you showed, you know, a bit of gumption that you could get on.
And of course, in 1904, he set up a private limited company, and all the shareholders were members of staff in his shops, which was unusual at that time. In fact, one of the first people to do that.
During the first week of the lockout, members of the Dublin Metropolitan Police baton-charged the crowd who were listening to Jim Larkin address a meeting on O'Connell Street. Larkin was arrested and 2 people were killed during the riots that followed. But in the background, people like Tom Kettle and Edward Lee were trying to see if peace talks could be held. Edward Lee's first intervention into the lockout dispute was this letter.
About a month into the dispute, Edward Lee was obviously getting worried for his business. So he wrote this letter, which was a plea for a conference. He wrote this to both, as far as I know, the Freeman's Journal and the Irish Independent, ironically. And it's a very interesting letter, and it is quite interestingly worded, because he obviously, as an employer, wants to stay on side with the employers, but he also wants to hold out an olive branch to the employees. So for the employers, he would say things like the employers should withdraw the pledge. But to the workers, in this instance, he says the workers must give up the baneful doctrine of tainted goods. So it's quite interesting, the subtle use of language. The last paragraph of the letter is quite interesting because he says, surely there are some public men whom each side can trust who would bring about a conference to consider again the whole position in a spirit of sanity and reason. It's interesting, the reaction to great-grandfather's letter, wasn't it?
It was.
The fact that James Connolly the very next day is interviewed about the letter, and he feels that great-grandfather is already trying to get both sides to give way on the issues that they're both obviously entrenched in.
They're totally entrenched and they don't want to change.
No, they don't.
No.
It's too early.
Yeah.
Oh, where is our James Conley?
On Saturday, at a ceremony in Dunleary, Edward Lee, the employer who sympathised with the workers during the 1913 lockout, was one of 4 people being commemorated with a plaque.
The bravery of Edward Lee was that he stood up against his class, his friends, his network, by publicly calling on other employers to withdraw the pledge requiring their employees to cease to belong to the ITGWU. Employers, as Edward Lee wrote, employers ought rather to seek to elevate those whom they employ rather than to inflict indignity on them. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well done. Hold the clock.
Friends, comrades, citizens, the mission that I have come to preach is the divine mission of discontent. Brothers and sisters, for the last 7 months, the employers of Dublin have used starvation as their weapon upon defenseless women and children, hoping in that way to break the manhood of husbands, fathers, friends, and brothers.
William Martin Murphy saw off Edward Lee's further attempts at peace, and he saw off Larkin and Connolly too. In the years that followed, Edward Lee became even more convinced that workers deserved rights. In a 1918 letter to his son Tennyson, he wrote,
Possibly you've not heard of the strike at Arnott's. The place is closed since Wednesday night. I fear the firm are wrong as they refuse to discuss matters with the union. That day is gone and the workers are determined to get a place in the sun. And this is key, which I think is quite as it should be. Now that I think probably sums up better than anything our great-grandfather's attitude towards
his attitude was he was very much for the union and having
workers' rights.
Having rights.
Yes.
That was it. It was simple as that.
It's heartening to see that people like Edward Lee are not forgotten. And you know, there's no shortage of events commemorating the Dublin lockout of 1913, including a state commemoration